For a modern European, being clean usually means taking a shower every day, brushing teeth twice a day, and using deodorant without thinking twice. These habits feel natural because we live in a world of running water, indoor plumbing, cheap soap, electric toothbrushes, and shelves full of hygiene products. Cleanliness is convenient, expected, and mostly effortless. In the Middle Ages, however, life followed very different rules. Judging medieval people by modern standards has created a powerful myth that they were always filthy, never bathed, and did not care about hygiene. This image is dramatic, but it is also deeply misleading. Medieval people did care about cleanliness, just not in the same way we do today. Most medieval Europeans simply could not bathe every day, even if they wanted to. Water did not flow from taps. It had to be collected by hand from wells, rivers, or communal water sources. Carrying even a single bucket required real physical effort. If warm water was needed, fuel had to be burned, and fuel was valuable. Wood and charcoal were not wasted lightly. Ironically, the hard labor of fetching and heating water often caused sweating, making the idea of frequent full bathing feel pointless. Bathing became an occasional task, not a daily routine. Religious beliefs strongly influenced attitudes toward washing. In many monasteries, rules allowed monks to bathe only once or twice a year unless they were ill. Medical texts did approve of baths for healing, but everyday washing was restricted. Early Christian thinkers often believed that physical discomfort brought spiritual purity. To suffer in the body was to imitate Christ's suffering. For some believers, avoiding bathing became a deliberate act of devotion. Still, even the strictest monks usually washed their hands and faces, just as ordinary people did. Daily life in the Middle Ages was physically demanding. Around 80% of the population worked in agriculture or manual trades. People walked long distances, worked outdoors, and used their hands constantly. Meals were usually eaten with fingers, not cutlery. Because of this, basic washing was necessary. Hands, faces, and mouths were cleaned regularly, often several times a day. Full body bathing was rare, but partial washing was a normal part of life. Early Christian writers clearly expressed these ideas. In the 4th century, St. Jerome wrote to Heliodorus, a bishop in Italy, asking whether his skin had grown rough because he no longer bathed. Jerome argued that someone washed through faith no longer needed physical washing. Jerome himself lived for a time as a hermit in the Syrian desert, embracing hunger, heat, and dirt as tools for spiritual discipline. His words carried great influence. Other devout Christians followed similar paths. Melania the Younger, a wealthy Roman woman, wanted to live chastely and convinced her husband to accept a sexless marriage by refusing to wash. When this strategy worked, and she later became the head of a convent on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem, she ordered a private bath to be built for her nuns. This is one of the earliest recorded bathhouses within a monastic community. Even the most devoted believers understood that total neglect of hygiene was not practical for everyone. Many saints became famous for extreme rejection of cleanliness. Saint Godric walked all the way to Jerusalem on pilgrimage without bathing or changing his clothes. Saint Francis described a dirty body as a badge of holiness and praised monks whose living spaces were filthy. Saint Radegund avoided bathing herself but willingly washed others, even when they suffered from scabs, lice, and infected wounds. These stories were meant to inspire humility, not to set rules for ordinary life. The body of Archbishop Thomas Becket provides one of the most famous examples. When he was murdered in Canterbury Cathedral and prepared for burial, monks discovered that his hair shirt was alive with fleas and lice. The parasites attacked his skin constantly, yet he endured them as an act of devotion. A similar account appears in the investigation into the saintship of Thomas Cantilupe, Bishop of Hereford. Witnesses reported that he never bathed, and that his clothes and bedding were so infested they had to be cleaned before being given away. Royal saints also practiced severe self-denial. Margaret of Hungary refused to wash her hair so that she would suffer the pain of lice. Lawrence of Sebasto, a former soldier turned hermit, wore chainmail directly against his skin as penance. The metal tore at his flesh while lice lived inside it. Henry Suso, a Dominican mystic, wore gloves lined with sharp pins so that scratching his lice-infested skin would cause pain even in his sleep. Two Polish duchesses, Hedwig of Silesia and Kinga of Poland, were well known for avoiding bathing. In one 14th century illustration, Hedwig is shown washing herself with water that had already been used to clean the feet of nuns, a powerful image of humility. Another holy woman, Catherine of Genoa, went even further by eating lice to overcome her disgust and prove her spiritual strength. The medieval church often warned against what it considered excessive grooming. In the 9th century, a monk known as Notker the Stammerer wrote a cautionary tale about a deacon who washed too much. The man bathed often, shaved closely, cleaned his nails, trimmed his hair precisely, and wore spotless white linen. In the story, a spider touched his head during church. Soon after, he swelled up and died. The lesson was clear. Outer cleanliness could hide inner corruption. This story was not about hygiene itself, but about pride. Cleanliness became dangerous when it was linked to vanity. The medieval church did not teach that washing was sinful, only that loving the body too much was. Extreme examples of saintly filth left a strong impression on later generations, helping create the myth of the dirty Middle Ages. Yet, these figures were never meant to represent ordinary medieval life. They were admired precisely because their behavior was unusual. To understand medieval hygiene, we must separate religious extremes from everyday reality. Only then does the picture become clear. Despite the extreme religious examples that dominate many stories, ordinary medieval people did not admire dirt. Living with parasites was not seen as holy, fashionable, or desirable. Lice, fleas, and filth were considered unpleasant and embarrassing, and people worked constantly to control them. The idea that medieval Europeans simply accepted being dirty is wrong. Surviving letters, village records, and eyewitness accounts all point to one truth: people tried hard, within their limits, to stay clean. One of the most important tools in medieval hygiene was clothing, especially linen worn next to the skin. Long before the Middle Ages, the Roman historian Tacitus observed that Germanic tribes considered undergarments a sign of wealth. By medieval times, linen underwear had become common wherever people could afford it. Linen absorbed sweat, protected outer clothing, and could be washed far more easily than heavy wool garments. Clean linen meant a cleaner body. Historian Virginia Smith notes that medieval people usually wore linen garments both day and night, removing them only when sleeping or washing. If these underclothes were changed regularly, much of the dirt and many parasites could be controlled. Lice lived in fabric as much as on skin. Shifting, washing, and drying linen was one of the most effective hygiene practices available. Cleanliness was not about soap and baths alone. It was about managing clothing. For the wealthy, this system worked relatively well. At the court of King Edward IV of England, royal records show regular payments to laundresses. Laundry was taken seriously and handled by specialists. One worker was known as the Lavender Man. His job was to buy fragrant flowers and roots to freshen the king's clothing and bedding. Garments were aired, brushed, and scented so they would breathe more wholesomely and delectably. This was medieval fabric care, not neglect. Life was much harder for the poor. In 1499, the Swiss student Thomas Platter described his experience in Germany. He wrote that scholars and townspeople alike were crawling with vermin, especially during summer. Platter washed his shirt in a river whenever he could. While it dried, he cleaned his other clothes by hand. He gathered the lice he found, dug a hole, buried them, and placed a cross on top. His words are half joking, half desperate, but they show constant effort, not indifference. Delousing was not only a private task, it was deeply social. In most households, mothers cleaned children, wives cleaned husbands, and servants cleaned their masters. This grooming often happened while people talked, rested, or shared stories. Inquisitorial records from the Cathar investigations give us a rare and intimate glimpse into village life in 14th century southern France, particularly in the village of Montelou. These records describe grooming as a daily activity. Mistresses deloused their lovers, servants deloused their employers, daughters cleaned mothers, and mothers cleaned future sons-in-law. This was normal, routine behavior. It happened by the fire, at the window, on benches, and even in bed. Removing parasites was part of ordinary care, like mending clothes or preparing food. One respected family in Montelou, the Claires, offers especially vivid examples. Pierre Claire, the village priest, was deloused by his lovers, Raymond and Beatrice, who was of noble birth. Sometimes this happened privately, sometimes openly. Raymond even deloused Pierre's mother in full view of neighbors, casually exchanging gossip as she worked. For leading families, finding someone to remove lice was never a problem. This kind of grooming also followed armies. A 12th century chronicler of the Third Crusade noted that the only women allowed to travel with the army were older women whose job was to wash clothing and remove fleas. These women were described as tireless and fearless, spending long hours picking vermin from soldiers' clothes and bodies. Their work was so intense that it was said to damage their hearing, yet it was considered essential. Historian Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie reminds us how closely medieval people lived together. In Montelou and countless other villages, people slept several to a bed. They drank from the same cups and ate from shared plates. Privacy was rare. In such conditions, hygiene was about managing shared bodies, not isolating oneself. Shaving and bathing were uncommon, but grooming never stopped. Bathing itself was viewed with caution. Swimming and crossing water were often considered dangerous. Springs and baths were sometimes reserved for the sick, especially people with leprosy or skin diseases. This association made full bathing less attractive. When washing did occur, it focused on parts of the body involved in work, worship, and eating. Hands, faces, and mouths mattered most. Washing of the genitals and anal areas was viewed suspiciously by many medieval Christians. These practices were associated with Jewish customs and therefore treated with mistrust in a largely Catholic society. This did not mean people never washed these areas, but it did mean such acts were not openly discussed or encouraged. Even so, many households owned wooden tubs or barrels. Bathing often involved pouring water over the body rather than full immersion. A jug, a basin, and a cloth could go a long way. Washing was done carefully, sparingly, and purposefully. Smell also carried different meanings. As late as the 18th century, many people believed that strong body odors showed vitality and strength, especially in men. A scent of sweat was not automatically offensive. When everyone smelled similar, odor stopped standing out. Medieval noses were trained by shared experience. The key point is this: medieval people did not love dirt. They lived with it because life demanded it, but they fought it constantly. They cleaned clothes, removed parasites, washed daily where it mattered, and developed routines suited to their world. Their hygiene was practical, social, and deeply human. The myth of the filthy medieval world survives because we focus too much on extremes. When we look instead at daily life, village records, and personal voices, a very different picture emerges, one of effort, care, and quiet resilience. By the later Middle Ages, the idea that medieval people were indifferent to dirt simply does not hold up. Outside the world of saints, hermits, and extreme religious devotion, most ordinary men and women found parasites unpleasant, uncomfortable, and embarrassing. Evidence from villages, towns, and cities across Europe shows that people worked constantly to control dirt and vermin, even if they lacked the means to eliminate them completely. Cleanliness mattered, not as a modern ideal of freshness, but as a daily struggle against discomfort and disease. In places like Montaillou, the historical records show grooming was not rare or shameful. Delousing happened all the time. It happened by the fire, in doorways, on benches, and even in public view. Mothers deloused children, daughters deloused parents, servants deloused masters, and lovers deloused one another. These moments were social, conversational, and familiar. Removing lice was no more unusual than sewing a torn sleeve or mending a shoe. The goal was not perfection, but control. What is important to understand is that medieval hygiene worked differently from modern hygiene. Today, cleanliness is achieved largely through water, soap, and isolation. In the Middle Ages, cleanliness was achieved through clothing, grooming, and repetition. Linen played a central role. Almost everyone who could afford it wore linen directly against the skin. Linen absorbed sweat, trapped dirt, and could be washed far more easily than heavy wool. Changing linen regularly was one of the most effective ways to stay clean in a world without plumbing. Medical and household texts from the medieval period repeatedly advised people to wash their hands and face throughout the day. Hands touched food, tools, animals, and other people. Faces were visible and associated with dignity and respect. Mouths were washed after eating. Teeth were cleaned using cloths, sticks, powders, or herbal rinses. These practices were not rare or exotic. They were recommended, expected, and widely followed, especially among townspeople and the wealthy. Full body bathing, however, remained complicated. Bathing required large amounts of water, time, fuel, and privacy. For the poor, this made frequent bathing impractical. For the religious, it was sometimes viewed as dangerous to the soul. But this did not mean bathing disappeared. Many households owned wooden tubs or barrels. Bathing often meant pouring water over the body rather than soaking in it. It was careful, limited, and purposeful. Washing specific parts of the body was far more common than full immersion. In larger towns and cities, communal bathhouses existed throughout much of the Middle Ages. These bathhouses offered hot water, steam, and sometimes even food and drink. They were places of cleanliness, relaxation, and social interaction. Contrary to popular belief, medieval bathhouses were not automatically associated with immorality. That association developed later, particularly after outbreaks of disease and changing religious attitudes. For much of the medieval period, public bathing was considered healthy and beneficial. Laundry was another essential part of medieval cleanliness. Washerwomen played a vital role in urban life. In cities, rivers often had designated areas where laundry could be done. In London, one such place was known as La Laundress's Bridge, a name that suggests both organization and routine. Linen underclothes were washed frequently, sometimes daily among the wealthy. Outer garments were brushed, aired, and perfumed with herbs rather than washed, as wool was difficult to clean with water alone. At the English court of King Edward IV, cleanliness was taken seriously. Royal accounts show regular payments to launderers. One man, known as the Lavender Man, was responsible for scenting the king's clothing and bedding using flowers and roots. This was not vanity in the modern sense, but maintenance. Clean, aired, and scented fabrics were more comfortable, longer lasting, and less likely to harbor vermin. For the poor, cleanliness required far more effort. Thomas Platter's account from late 15th century Germany paints a vivid picture of student life filled with lice and hardship. He describes washing his shirt in a river, then spending hours picking parasites from his clothing. The act of burying the lice and marking the spot with a cross was grimly humorous, but it also shows determination. Even those with almost nothing still tried to fight dirt and infestation. Military life posed its own challenges. Armies on campaign were crowded, filthy, and full of parasites. Chroniclers of the Crusades note that older women traveled with armies to wash clothing and remove fleas. These women worked endlessly, often suffering injuries and exhaustion themselves. Their labor was essential. Without clean clothing and basic grooming, soldiers weakened, fell ill, and became ineffective. Hygiene, even in war, was a matter of survival. It is also important to remember how medieval people lived together. Families often shared beds. Communities shared cups, plates, tools, and spaces. Privacy was rare. In such conditions, constant low-level grooming was necessary. Delousing, washing hands, changing linen, and airing clothes were ongoing processes. Cleanliness was not a single act, but a rhythm woven into daily life. The medieval attitude towards smell was also very different from our own. Body odor was expected. It was not automatically offensive. In fact, as late as the 18th century, some believed a strong bodily scent signaled strength and vitality, especially in men. When everyone smelled similar, no one stood out. Smell only became a problem when it signaled illness or decay, not ordinary labor. What all of this evidence shows is that medieval people did not enjoy being dirty. They did not glorify filth outside of very specific religious contexts. They worked constantly to stay as clean as their world allowed. Their methods were different, their standards were different, but their intentions were clear. Cleanliness mattered, comfort mattered, dignity mattered. The idea of the medieval world as a place of universal, careless filth is a myth built on misunderstanding. When we look closely at records, homes, clothing, and habits, we see a society doing its best with limited resources. Medieval hygiene was not absent. It was practical, persistent, and deeply human. By the end of this journey, it becomes clear that the idea of medieval people as permanently filthy is far too simple and deeply misleading. Dirt existed, parasites existed, and strong smells were part of everyday life, but that was true because of material limits, not because people did not care. Medieval Europeans lived in a world without plumbing, without cheap fuel, and without mass-produced soap. Cleanliness had to be negotiated daily, shaped by labor, belief, and environment rather than convenience. What mattered most was effort, not perfection. For those who were not trying to achieve holiness through suffering, being covered in lice or grime was considered unpleasant and shameful. The constant delousing described in villages like Montagu shows that people actively fought against parasites whenever they could. Grooming was social. Mothers cleaned children, lovers cleaned each other, servants cleaned their masters, and friends sat together picking vermin while talking. It was not glamorous, but it was normal, accepted, and continuous. Cleanliness was something you worked at together. Washing focused on what mattered most in daily life. Hands, faces, and mouths were cleaned often because they touched food, tools, and other people. Linen underclothes were changed and washed as frequently as resources allowed, acting as a barrier between the body and the outer world. Wool garments were brushed, aired, and scented, rather than soaked. Water was used carefully and sparingly, not wasted. Even when full bathing was rare, Maintenance never stopped. Religious suspicion of excessive bathing did not mean a rejection of hygiene. Instead, it created a culture that valued moderation. Too much washing could signal vanity, softness, or moral weakness, especially among clerics. Yet the same church that warned against indulgence also produced medical texts advising medicinal baths, recipes for clean skin and hair, and guidance for oral care. Medieval people lived within contradictions, balancing spiritual ideals with physical needs. Class made a difference, but not as much as we might expect. The wealthy could afford washerwomen, scented herbs, fresh linen, and access to bathhouses in large cities. The poor relied on rivers, shared basins, and their own hands. Still, both groups understood cleanliness in similar ways. They accepted smells that we would find offensive today because everyone shared them. As later writers observed, when all bodies smell alike, no single body stands out. It is important to remember that medieval Europe was not one place or one moment. Customs changed over time and varied by region. Urban centers developed organized laundry spaces and bathhouses. Rural communities relied on rivers and seasonal routines. What remained constant was the belief that care of the body mattered, even if it looked very different from modern standards. The myth of the filthy Middle Ages survives largely because later centuries judged the past using modern expectations. We forget how much effort our own cleanliness requires. Running water, soap factories, electricity, disposable products. Medieval people worked harder for less dramatic results, but the intention was always there. They washed when they could, cleaned what they could, and accepted what they could not change. As Saint Bernard of Clairvaux wisely observed in the 11th century, "Where all stink, no one smells." It is a blunt reminder that cleanliness is always relative, shaped by culture and circumstance. The medieval world was not one of careless filth, but of constant negotiation between body, belief, and survival. Understanding that truth allows us to see medieval people not as curiosities of a dirty past, but as humans doing their best with the tools they had.